Okay, welcome Professor Corrales to this second interview. This second part of an initial interview within the framework of the subject. Research and Sustainability at the Metropolitan University. Professor Corrales, as I introduced him in the first interview, is a specialist in development issues, the economy of globalization. He is a mechanical engineer from the Central University of Venezuela, with a diploma in public policy. He also has a master's degree in development planning from CENDES and from the UCB. He directs the NGO Response to Development and is part of the NGO Grupo Renoco and is a member of the National Academy of Engineering and Habitat. Welcome, Professor, and we are going to continue the interview that I did with you on the subject of sustainable development. In this first part of the interview, you answered questions like, I'm going to give you a little overview of the topics we worked on regarding the fundamental concepts of sustainable human development are related. Freedom and individual fulfillment, as well as the concept of human capabilities to act, as well as questions regarding when a society continues to develop, e.h. Also the importance of institutions, of imaginaries, of the use of capabilities and of roles. The importance of roles in achieving development objectives. Having addressed this topic, then I begin with the following question, for you, Professor. What is the importance of a country's relations with the rest of the world in order to achieve sustainable human development? Look, thank you very much, Maria Antonietta. I'm going to comment directly on your question. Since, I would say, before the Renaissance, since the Middle Ages, there began to be cultural and commercial exchanges based on the technologies that were mastered until that time, which were of land communication and in some cases navigation technologies. But from that very moment began what has been called in the last 30 years a process of progressive globalization. That is to say, the different societies began to relate in international cooperation began to appear, became even more conflicts between societies and wars. Then in that framework a society, the economy of a society grows to the extent that it exports. The more it exports, the more it grows. On the other hand, the new knowledge, the innovations that a certain society develops, the technologies it puts into practice, are exchanged or are accessed from other societies through international relations. Cultural relations that range from or are based on, for example, the shared language, but in many other manifestations of culture, in common interpretations that different societies begin to have in relation to the phenomena that they experience. All these processes, they have some relation with those processes that we talked about in the first interview that you did with me. In short, the vision of a society on the processes that it is experiencing is enriched to the extent that it has relations with another. Its economy grows to the extent that exports increase. Already in a much more contemporary economy, let's talk about the 19th, 20th and 21st centuries. It's not only the flows of trade. That is, the exports that each country sends to the rest of the world. It's also about, everything that is the flows of capital. Investments, what is called foreign investments. Investments that actors from one country make in another country to start up economic activities and the much more systematic flows. Yes, the much more systematic flows. that occur in technological terms. In that sense, international relations are very important for growth, for the development of knowledge, for processes of civilization in different societies. Professor, and what do you mean by the concept of development style? When we talk about the development style of a society, of a country, yes, this is the concept of development style. It is a very important concept to discuss, especially for people who are interested in development issues. I am going to make a small preamble, maybe I will go on a bit in this answer because I think it is very important to clarify for non-specialists some issues related to development. There is a very common confusion between what development is and what growth is. Development implies the growth of the economy. But it is not enough to talk about the growth of the economy. To be able to describe the process that a society is going through, the development process, as we said in our last interview, implies the expansion of the freedoms and capabilities of each person. It implies cooperation to create systemic capabilities of society as a whole. But another very common confusion is that, as I said, the first is confusing development and growth. The second is confusing development model. Development model with development style. The term development model has been in circulation, so to speak, since the 19th century. In the 19th century, there was no talk of development per se. There was talk of progress, there was talk of growth. In short, but above all, the ideas of Marx, of Karl Marx, and of Friedrich Engels, who spoke a lot about the mode of production. These ideas generated at the end of the 19th century and throughout the 20th century, let's say, a convention among scholars of the social sciences that called a model belonging to a capitalist mode of production, for example, a mode of production assumed or proposed. Socialist thinkers of the 19th and 20th centuries. Higher mode, which was socialism, so the model came to be used to identify capitalism. So there was the capitalist model, there was the socialist model, which, as I say, they considered it more advanced, more perfect, more beneficial for the society that lived it. So the term model, let's go back now, let's go into your question. You're talking to me, you ask me what I consider a development style, and I wanted to clarify that development style and development model are two different concepts. I already talked about what could be considered a development model, what social scientists mean when they talk about a model. They talk about belonging to capitalism, belonging to socialism, or belonging to a form of state capitalism. That is, the rules of operation of the economy are capitalist. But the main entrepreneur is the state, and development style refers to something else, and it is very important to think about the future of Venezuela. What has happened to us since the beginning of the 20th century? Until today, and in what may be the future. The development style is a form, a way of operating all the relations of society, which is and is greatly influenced by institutions. Institutions are the sets of rules and conventions that are established to facilitate the functioning of a society. The development style is a way or a mode of functioning of the entire society, greatly influenced by institutions. That is to say, by the rules, and that ends up invading. Or let's say ends up affecting all spheres The spheres of capabilities, the spheres of freedom. The spheres of imaginations and achievements, what has been the development style that visa to Venezuela, then since the beginning of the 20th century. The Venezuelan development style has been characterized as rentism. Rentism refers nothing more than to the fact that Venezuela receives income fundamentally derived from the rent that comes from the export of oil. Rentism is, I repeat, a way of functioning of all societies. That is, a style of development, in which the fundamental thing in economic terms is to depend on rent. But in institutional terms and in cultural terms. In terms of the imaginary, it goes much further, in rentism, in the model, in the rentier style of development, which is what Venezuela has experienced since the beginning of the 20th century. There is an institutional characteristic that is that practically all fundamental initiatives come from the state. They do not come from individuals, from people as they should be in a society that lives on a path of development or that lives in ideal process of sustainable development. That is precisely the first feature of rentism. The question is precisely what you just talked about regarding a path of development. What do you mean when you talk about a path of development? What do you mean when you let me finish explaining to you the explanation about the style of development, because it is very important, and it is not just the features that I have mentioned. The features that characterize the style of development, particularly our rentier style of development, are, first, the fundamental initiatives that explain the progress or the development or the regression of society come from the state. They do not come from individuals, from people. On the other hand, freedoms, the having such concentration. There is a lot of power in the Venezuelan state, due to the fact that income is concentrated, deciding how and where the income is applied, etc., and due to the concentration, as I was saying, of initiatives. Not only oil initiatives. Freedom begins to be diminished. The freedom of each member of society, autonomy, begins to be lost. And the worst thing is the autonomy of decision of each person. And the worst thing is that a culture is being generated, it is expanding, let's say in the population group that shares a culture according to which initiatives must come from the state. I must benefit from the initiatives instead of the initiatives must come from me. That I must realize myself on the basis. The autonomous application of my capabilities is an inversion of the roles of a real democracy. And finally, there is also, that is to say, the first feature I was telling you about, the concentration of initiatives in the state. The second very important feature is a culture of the individual, in which he no longer claims his autonomy but expects the state to do for him. And the third is that when the third very important feature, when the abundance of resources that there was in Venezuela between the years 1925, for example, and 1975, 50 years in which there was an abundance because the oil income was more than sufficient to cover the demands of a population that was very small. The Venezuelan population goes from being in the order of 400,000 inhabitants in the 20s of the last century to being in the order of 10 million inhabitants in the 70s of the last century. But from that moment on, those resources begin to be relatively scarce, in the way in which the state assumes to continue fulfilling its role that it had had until that moment is to become a Populism, rentier populism. Instead of creating capacities to invest. In very clear terms, to invest a lot in education. To make quality education accessible to all children. To invest a lot in health, to invest in infrastructure, it no longer has the resources for that, and it simply begins to issue currency and inflation is generated. To issue currency to have how to pay, how to give subsidies that today we would see as the clap boxes, and that inflation ends up generating enormous poverty. Over the years, in addition to having neglected training, education, for example, means that young people who enter the workforce do not have the capabilities that many young people had in previous years.